Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, Katie Brackett-Fialka, and today I'm talking with Kevin Levin, who is a Boston-based historian and educator. Kevin's here to talk to us about a topic that has certainly seen some controversy, and that is the idea of Black Confederates. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So, could you start by maybe explaining a little bit about why there seems to be a continued endurance of the idea of Black Confederates?
Sure. I think the most important point to start off with is to understand that this narrative of Black Confederate soldiers is a relatively recent development. And what I mean by that is that before the late 1970s, you would have been hard pressed to find any references to Black Confederate soldiers. The language was more along the lines of talking about servants, camp servants, or loyal slaves. But really no one that I found in roughly 8 years of research talked about soldiers before the late 1970s. And so there are a couple things that happened at that time that I think explain this. First thing is just our understanding of slavery, and the role of slavery in the Confederacy is really sort of taking shape, evolving in the late 1970s. We're learning a lot more about slavery at that time. The other thing is, museums and historic sites are also beginning to address slavery, places like Monticello, Williamsburg, other historic sites. And then what I found is that one of the most important moments in the late 1970s is the airing of the television series Roots, and very popular, television series. And I think for the first time you can say that a large segment of the viewing public is exposed to the horrors of slavery, right? As opposed to sort of this lost cause or something more aligned with what many people would have remembered from Gone with the Wind. Mm-hmm. And what I found in my research is that the organization, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, took notice of this popularity and started talking amongst themselves about ways to counteract this growing narrative. First, the negative aspect of slavery that I just mentioned. But then as you get into the 80s, this growing understanding or appreciation of the role of Black Union soldiers. And that sort of culminates in 1989 with the movie Glory. So you start seeing the SCV and other heritage groups talking about ways to counteract it. And they start talking about, what if we could talk about our own loyal Black Confederate soldiers? And so many of the accounts that they had been focused on leading up to this period, which were framed as loyal slaves, are now being referenced as soldiers. Mm-hmm. So you start seeing a couple publications in the 1980s and early 90s, sort of small basement type presses that are publishing primary documents that are poorly interpreted or just poorly written and researched secondary types of resources. But it's not until the rise of the internet that this narrative really takes off. And in my view, it really doesn't have any legs at all without the internet. Mm-hmm. And what you find, you can do searches on the internet on your favorite search engine for Black Confederate or Black Confederates, and you're going to find tens of thousands of websites. Many of them, as I've learned over the years, are simply cut and pasted from one another. So you'll find quite often a relatively small number of stories about Silas Chandler, of course, who is wonderfully documented in this incredible photograph of Silas, the Black servant slave, sitting next to Andrew, his owner, and they're both holding weapons and knives. They were in a Mississippi unit, and this photographs like this are sort of passed on various websites, and it quickly evolved into this modern myth, which is exactly what it is. You're not going to find any reputable historian who gives much credit to these stories. But within the general public, and it's interesting, we can talk about this, ways in which this myth has emerged. It's just, like I said, taken on a life of its own. It's really quite remarkable. And it really shows no signs of letting up. The last time it emerged was just this past summer in South Carolina, in Charleston or Columbia, right after or as the state government was thinking about lowering the Confederate battle flag, the state division of the SCV, the South Carolina SCV, held a press conference on the Capitol grounds. And if you go and read the speech, the commander talks about the loyalty of these Black Confederate soldiers clearly as a means to diffuse the racial tension, saying, of course, that this flag really, it's not a racist symbol because within the Confederate Army, you could find hundreds, if not thousands, of these loyal Black Confederate soldiers. And the number is important. You're going to find on the internet anywhere between 100 and 100,000 soldiers that supposedly served in the Army. And I've heard it said by one historian in particular that if Robert E. Lee knew that he had somewhere around 30,000 Black Confederate soldiers, he would have been one happy guy, say in 1863.
Very, very interesting. So, what do you think then, in terms of what the Confederates might have thought the role of free blacks and black slaves was during the war? What do you think is a more accurate picture of their ideas?
Yeah, I think we actually can have, we can arrive at a fairly clear understanding of what they thought, because there's plenty of evidence for it. And that's what's also interesting about this narrative, which is that, with all of the stories that are bandied about on the internet, it's amazing to me how few people actually dig into the archival record, because Confederates between 1861 and 65 are very clear about the relationship between the slave population and even the free Black population and the Confederate war effort, right? And for us, it's a fairly clear tension because Confederate leaders, politicians, are very clear about what the goal of their government is. It's to establish an independent slaveholding republic, and so it's not quite clear how slaves would fit into that agenda, that mission. So clearly, they play a central role because, just given the population differences between North and South, the Confederacy needs to employ as much manpower as possible. And so, you see very early on, and this develops in stages, the Confederate government utilizing ever-increasing numbers of slaves to do various supportive roles. So digging earthworks, following the army around as teamsters, driving trucks, things like that, working in hospitals, working on railroads, any kind of infrastructure role, you're going to find slaves performing those jobs. Mm-hmm. There's obviously some tension between their owners and the government as impressment of slaves kicks in, and that's been studied quite a bit by a couple historians in recent years. And I think the most interesting way in which they are involved, and this sort of drives my research, is their presence in camp as camp servants. And so a lot of the stories that you're going to hear today and that are sort of discussed on the internet are stories about slaves that accompanied their masters, usually officers, junior grade officers, and higher up the ranks into the army. And they also play, of course, various roles. They're there as sort of social symbols, right, in terms of reinforcing the social rank of their owners. They're there to perform certain roles, you name it. And this sort of relationship evolves over the course of the war. And what's interesting is that at no point really before the end or middle of 1864, I should say early 1864, do you begin to hear the Confederate government considering transitioning from the supportive roles that slaves are playing to soldiers. And that, of course, is a very difficult discussion for white Confederates, Southerners, to have at this time. So it's a discussion between defeat, the end of their cause, and having to give in on this issue of slavery. And it's not until March of 1865 that the Confederate Congress does approve allowing slaves who are first freed by their masters to serve in the army. And so within a few weeks of that, of course, Lee is surrendered at Appomattox, and the other armies shortly thereafter are surrendered. So, before that, and what's interesting, I should point this out, that, quite often the evidence that's used by people today to prove the existence of these men are Union accounts. And these are very problematic accounts because many of them are secondhand, third hand. Some of them are observations of black men in the army or in camp, and that of course has to do with the roles they played. Mm-hmm. And I have no doubt that some of these men even on occasion picked up a weapon and fired it at a Yankee. Mm-hmm. But the point I want to make here, and I think it's a really important one, is that I have yet to come across a single wartime Confederate account, an account from, say, a soldier in the ranks who is writing home or writing in his diary who says, I'm fighting next to a black man, right? A fellow soldier. You don't find any of that. And that is quite remarkable given some of the numbers that are thrown about in terms of how many are serving. Some may have passed as white. That's also a possibility. Mm-hmm. But the Confederacy is strict on who is and who is not going to serve in the ranks as the citizen soldier.
Mm-hmm. So then you think that even the phrase Black Confederates might have been something that would be more scary than welcomed for Confederate soldiers.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's, from what I gather, they resist it with every fiber in their being, because I think they understand, and I think this is true for slave owners and non-slave owners alike. I mean, that's mm-hmm. a distinction that's often also sort of thrown around loosely. But I think especially after emancipation comes into play, and especially in places like Virginia in 1864, and you see this in battles like the Crater, which I've written about. Mm-hmm. When you're reading their accounts after the battle, and the anger they express about having to fight black men, it's impossible to tell the difference between who's a slave owner and who's a non-slave owner. My point is that I think they understand that armed black men does not bode well for what they are attempting to achieve. And that is true whether they're wearing a blue uniform or a gray uniform. And so I think they resist it. I think they finally, Lee and others finally accept it at the very end because there simply is no alternative. And that in and of itself is quite telling. Mm-hmm. But these kinds of very simple facts somehow fail to, inform the discussion, the popular discussion.
Well, this is very interesting. I wish we could talk more. If people are interested in learning more about Black Confederates or about your work, where could you send them?
Yeah, so I've written a couple things about this. I've been researching this for a couple years, but my website, Civil War Memory, cwmemory.com.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for talking with us, Kevin.
Yeah, my pleasure.